And we know planting date is about the number one management practices that influences yield of both crops. So for soybean, we've seen about a half a bushel per acre per day reduction in yield for each day we plant after the end of April. So as planting gets delayed, those bushels lost can add up very quickly.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show by Wisenetics. I'm your host, Leo Bastos, Assistant Professor in Integrative Precision Agriculture at the University of Georgia. Today, we welcome our guest, Dr. Laura Lindsey. She is the Soybean and Small Grain Extension Specialist at Ohio State University. Laura, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. It's great to have you here with us today. And to kick us off, could you share with us a little bit about your background and also the path that you took until you got to your position?
So I've been at Ohio State in this position now for almost 13 years. Doesn't seem like it's been that long, but it has been. I grew up in Ohio, so it's great to work for Ohio State. I got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree in soil science from Ohio State. And then, of course, it's always good to see somewhere else. So I went to Michigan State University for my PhD. I graduated from Michigan State in weed science and soil fertility in 2012 and immediately was able to join Ohio State as a faculty member just a few months later.
Perfect. And alongside that, could you also share with us a little bit of the current projects that you're working with?
Yeah, so my position is to do applied research. Since I have a large extension appointment, everything I do research-wise should be applicable to farmers, and my area is really soybean and small grain production. In Ohio, small grain generally means winter wheat, but we've worked on other small grains such as barley and rye, things like that. But we do a lot on agronomic management, so planting dates, seeding rates, row widths, seed treatments, variety selection, cultural practices that are of interest to farmers.
Perfect. Sounds great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And so perhaps one of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us, is about planting dates in Ohio. So just to get me and our audience more situated around this topic, could you tell us a little bit about what is the typical planting date of soybean and corn in Ohio, and why is this decision around planting date so important?
Yeah, so nothing is ever typical. I guess our range of planting dates could be, anywhere between early April into June or even July if we're talking about double crop soybeans. So the range can be quite large. Most people will probably try to plant between the middle of April through the middle of May. The problem in Ohio is that we don't have a lot of suitable fieldwork days, so we get just a lot of rainfall in the spring. So we know that ideal time might be middle of April to middle of May, but historically only about half of those days have been suitable for fieldwork. So that would include fertilizer application, pesticide application, tillage, everything. So we just really have a very limited number of field days. So we're looking at planting date because we know we can't always plant at the ideal time. And sometimes we may have to go earlier. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have to go later.
Perfect. And I guess, why is that decision, perhaps not just decision, but also the circumstances that a grower faces to actually be able to plant? Why is that such an important management practice?
Yeah, so we've done some work on, I guess, both corn and soybean planting date. I'm not the corn agronomist, but I work very closely with our corn agronomist, Dr. Osler Ortez, and we've both done planting date research for both crops. And we know planting date is about the number one management practices that influences yield of both crops. So for soybean, we've seen about a half a bushel per acre per day reduction in yield for each day we plant after the end of April. So as planting gets delayed, those bushels lost can add up very quickly.
Yeah, it's really. So you said half a bushel per acre per day lost after the last week of April?
About the last week of April. And there's variability. Some years it may be less, some years it may be more, but just as a rough rule of thumb, about half bushel per acre per day.
and you said that was in a specific crop, or is it for both crops?
That's for soybean. For corn,
soybean.
it might be a little bit more. Yep.
Yeah, that's a really key decision for sure. So to follow up on that, what are some of the main challenges when trying to optimize and find that? I guess, as you said, it's a challenge already just because of the suitable number of field days within the window. But perhaps outside of that, which is out of a farmer's control, what are some other things that perhaps can also be challenging when it comes to determining a planting date for these crops?
Yeah. So this year is a perfect example, or maybe not a perfect example. It's really wet in Ohio right now, and we've been wet probably for the past week or so. And right now is the ideal time to plant, and people can't plant, and our soils can take a long time to dry out in Ohio because we have heavy clay soils, poorly drained soils. And so some farmers planted early. So we have farmers that planted the end of March, early April. But when we plant early, and then get rainfall, there can be a lot of issues there. So we're seeing flooding. I got pictures of hail damage yesterday. I've gotten pictures of disease also yesterday. I haven't seen it yet, but in the past, when we plant early, sometimes we can see slug problems. So those occur. Last year, when we planted early, we got a freeze event at the end of April. So we saw a lot of plants die on the soybean side because of freeze damage. So when we plant early, there's an increased risk of all these issues. But if we wait and we end up in a situation now where it's really wet, you might be planting in June. So you have that yield reduction on that side. So challenging on both ends, but there are definite risks when you plant early.
And that's a great point that I think is I just want to go a little bit deeper on that. So this trade-off between planting too early, well, perhaps, the idea that planting on the best window may be difficult because of weather. So planting early could be a solution. Planting a little bit later can also be a solution. Each one of them with their respective challenges and trade-offs. Have you all seen data coming from Ohio from these trials about that trade-off? I mean, is it which risk of the two would be the least worse or the smallest to take? Is it planting early the least worse, or planting later the least worse, I guess?
Looking at some of our data, planting into June comes at a larger yield penalty. Last year in West Central Ohio, we had a range of planting dates, but we planted as early as March 25th, which is really early, and as late as about the middle of June. And that March 25th planting date had a lot of issues. I talked about the freeze damage. We lost a lot of plants. Our plant population was probably around 40 to 50,000 plants per acre, but it ended up yielding 74 bushels per acre, which was statistically the same as our planting dates going into the middle of May. What happened when we went to June, there was a 20 bushel loss. So March 25th to mid-June, 20 bushel loss. But my June stand was perfect. It was, 140,000, looked great. It was perfect, but there is a real yield penalty to that delayed planting. The problem is we did have a very, very low plant population because of that March planting date and the freeze conditions. And so there's additional management considerations there. So we had to really control weeds. That's a huge problem when we have low plant populations, is really being on top of the weed control.
Perfect. And this was the experience with soybeans, right?
This was the experience with soybeans, yes. And I should mention corn as well. Corn is different. Corn and soybean are very different crops. If we have stress early in the year, soybeans can handle it because you can lose a lot of plants and they can still have pretty high yields because they branch and they can compensate for those losses in plant stand. Corn, on the other hand, really likes to be planted into good conditions. And so when we're talking to farmers about planting day and trade-offs, if that planting window is limited, it's really best to do soybeans maybe in marginal conditions too early, and they can also maintain yields okay really into July if we think about double crop soybeans. But corn really has that sweet spot, and it likes to have good moisture, good temperature, and nice conditions.
Perfect. And I think especially when it comes down to the this component that you just mentioned on the plasticity of the crop to compensate for gaps or for decreased stand, right? Where soybeans can fill in that gap, but corn really does not. And
It does not.
I would imagine. So when it comes down to corn, thinking about the trade-off of perhaps planting too early and having poor stand, maybe uneven germination and stand overall, and comparing that to planting late, having a great stand, but perhaps already losing some of that heat units that because of that delayed planting. I guess of that trade-off specifically in corn, I guess what would you recommend?
Corn needs to be planted when it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, on either end, if you go too early with corn, it doesn't yield well. And if you go too late with corn, it doesn't yield well either. We do see that you can compensate a little bit with management by adjusting your relative maturity. As you plant later, we can sometimes reduce our yield losses by having an earlier relative maturity crop. So this in the same way, if we plant early, we can have a longer relative maturity. So adjusting relative maturity in corn can help, but really hitting that sweet spot in May for us in Ohio where soil and weather conditions are best is really the best for corn.
So I think you already mentioned some of these, but perhaps if we can expand on what are some of the main abiotic and biotic stressors that will be associated with early planted soybeans in this case.
Yeah, so last year we had freeze damage, and with soybeans, that growing point is above the ground, and they died with the freeze damage. Sometimes they just get dinged up a little bit and they're fine, but if that growing point dies, the plant is dead. On corn, though, the growing point is actually below the ground when we had that freeze last year, so it looked like the whole plants died because they just all turned brown, but they didn't. But they always looked just a little bit uneven to me. Even though they recovered, it wasn't quite as pretty as what it usually is. So freeze damage is a big one. We get a lot of rainfall, and so we see a lot of saturated soils, flooding conditions, and that's not good either. We can get drowned out spots, things like that. Slugs, we haven't seen them yet this year. I haven't heard of reports of slugs this year, but slugs certainly have been a problem with earlier planted crops. Diseases can happen anytime, but when it's wetter, we see issues with water molds in Ohio. So that's another one.
So the slug damage is really interesting. Is there were you all able to collect enough data on this to really understand the extent of the slug damage as far as yield penalties?
So our entomologist, Dr. Kelly Tillman, has done a lot of work on slugs. For me, I've tried to do work on slugs, but every time I put out a slug trap, they don't come. So as soon as I try to do research on it, they all disappear. And then the years where I don't put out the traps, then the slugs come. So we haven't been able to grasp that real well in my lab, but I've seen damage with early planted soybeans, especially in no-till situations or where there's a lot of crop residue. But our entomologist is really the one focusing extensively on slugs.
So here's a question that perhaps a grower would have on their mind, and I think you already talked about some of this on the previous conversation. But so if a grower needs to, well, again, if they have the limited planting window and they have to choose, right? So let's say that they are in the prime of their planting season for both crops, and they have to choose which one they should go ahead and plant first and prioritize. And those handful of days or not handful, but that limited number of days that they have to do this, which one would you recommend they go first?
If it is prime planting conditions, I would go with corn. Only because corn yield, is high, and then as soon as you miss your peak, it just goes down very quickly. The yield reduction is very steep. Where soybean, there's a yield reduction as you plant later, but it's a much more gradual reduction. And that's why we have double crop soybeans in Ohio. We don't have double crop corn. Planting date is important for soybeans, but it's just such a more gradual reduction in yield compared to corn.
My next question here for you is related to, so we talked a lot about planting dates and the optimal window for these crops. Now, how does planting date interact with other management practices, right? So you were talking, we briefly mentioned about tillage. I would imagine you probably have an effect there as well, depending on the tillage system a grower uses, perhaps variety selection, or really any other management practice here that interacts with planting date, and perhaps being an extra or another tool for growers to help mitigate a later or too early planting date.
Yeah, I think planting date really touches probably on every aspect of management. You mentioned tillage, and we haven't done a controlled tillage study, but last year we planted soybeans on March 25th for two different studies. One just happened to be tilled, and the other field happened to be no-till. And we had that freeze event the end of April, and the tilled field had a plant population of about 50,000 plants per acre after that freeze event, where my no-till field had a population of 25,000, so about half of the tilled field. So we do see differences in freeze damage, whether it's tilled or no-till. Weed control, I think, is one of the biggest ones with early planting, because when we plant early, we see a low plant population for a variety of reasons. And what's interesting is when you plant early, it's cooler temperatures usually, and those soybeans are slow. They are really slow to grow. And you know what's not slow? What's not slow is giant ragweed. I have, dead soybean plants growing slow and the whole thing. The giant ragweed, it just keeps coming, which is why it's a weed. And so the soybean plants grow slowly, our canopy closure is slow, and weeds can really get a foothold very quickly. So we've done some work on weed management for early planted soybeans with our weed scientist, Dr. Alyssa Espin here. And so we've seen that you can't rely on pre-emergence herbicides for season-long control. They can help, but they won't give you season-long control. We needed multiple post applications to control weeds when our plant populations were so low for soybeans. And then also having a residual herbicide in that post application helped control weeds season long. Variety selection, that certainly comes into play with corn quite a bit, looking at relative maturities. If you plant earlier, you can have a longer relative maturity, and later you'll need to shorten it up. We've looked at seeding rate as well on soybeans. Not as big of an interaction as what I thought there would be. When we go really late with double crops, we have to increase our seeding rates, but not a whole lot in our recent research when we only go to early to mid-June. As long as we have a seeding rate over 100,000 seeds per acre, we're usually okay.
My next follow-up based on that is, so we have, as everything in nature and agriculture is so complex, right? There's so many things at play, interacting and impacting in different directions. But if we think from an economical standpoint, right? So perhaps planting early may give you, or maybe at the right window, but especially before that, perhaps, you may get a head start. It may have more uneven stands in the beginning, at least with soybeans, and you may have to invest more on weed control, weed control program, compared to maybe planting later, losing some of those units, but perhaps not having as many issues with weeds, at least not after the soybeans have been planted. When we put all that into like an economical perspective and thinking of the costs and the benefits so the cost on, in this case, we control the benefit on higher yielding potential, how does that come out?
So we have not done the economics on this, which is part of our objective. Long run is to look at the economic comparisons. And I think harvest date also plays a role too, and when you can sell, or even with corn, when you plant late, you might have to dry down the grain, which comes at another cost. So it's very complex. The economic parts are very complex, and we haven't crunched all of that yet, but certainly there are trade-offs. There will be trade-offs with planting dates and economic considerations for sure.
Well, I guess, speaking with our audience now, if you are enjoying this episode as much as I am, make sure to like this episode, follow us, subscribe, so you get notified of new episodes, which we have we've been publishing a lot of episodes. So make sure you subscribe to be on the loop on that. and also share with anyone else that you think may benefit from this great conversation with Dr. Lindsey.
It's time for our famous three.
Are you ready to maximize your acres? Discover KWS Hybrid Rye, the high-yielding rye with Pollen Plus technology. Designed for superior growth and resilience, KWS Hybrid Rye helps you achieve greater productivity and profitability. Don't miss out on this innovative solution for your fields. Visit KWS.com today to learn more about how KWS Hybrid Rye can transform your farming practices. KWS Hybrid Rye, growing innovation for your future.
All right, Laura, so we're getting towards the end of the episode here, which is the part that we ask every guest our three questions. And to begin, the first one here, I wanted to ask you if you have any recommendation of a agricultural-related resource that you came across and that is something you find useful for you that you could share with us.
Sure. I have it here. The one I use a lot is called the Ohio Agronomy Guide. And so this was first published in 1966, which is really an amazing history. And it's a compilation of all of our agronomic recommendations for corn, soybean, wheat, and forages. So we try to update it every 5 years or so. But I inherited that bulletin, when I first started in 2012, and I've used it almost weekly during the growing season as a reference on planting dates, seeding rates, all kinds of recommendations.
For our audience, is that something that they can perhaps download or maybe order online?
Yeah, so it's available for purchase at the Ohio State Extension Publishing bookstore online. I think it's about $35, which isn't too bad. Hopefully, if you just plan a little bit earlier, you'll make your money back using that book.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So if you're listening and you're interested, you can get a copy of that on the Ohio State University Extension website. All right. So the second question here is pretty similar as far as a resource that you found useful that you could share with us. However, outside of agriculture.
Yeah, outside of agriculture, I don't do a lot of reading. I listen a lot because extension people drive all over all the time. So I spend a lot of time in the car. So I like to listen to audiobooks. And I don't have one recommendation in general, but I listen to a lot of books about history and science and kind of the intersection of history and science, not necessarily in agriculture, but it could be outside of agriculture. And I think those are just interesting to me to see how scientific discoveries happen and the historical context that leads up to those discoveries.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And our last question here of the three is, through your experience and the people we work with, what have you seen as skills or a skill set that successful professionals have?
Yeah, so one thing I've benefited a lot by was having a good network of colleagues. The soybean agronomy group works really closely together. The group's called Science for Success. And we meet monthly over video calls, but in person 2 or 3 times per year. And we work on joint extension publications, research projects. And I've really benefited by just having a really good professional network. I have the cell phone number of almost every soybean agronomist handy. So when farmers ask me a question and I don't know the answer, I just have this huge network of people I can reach out to at any time. And that's been wonderful to have.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think I heard many times the saying of, it's not about what you know, but who you know. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, Laura, that basically wraps up our episode. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise in soybean and corn, planting dates, and all the other management practices that interact with that. I really learned a lot from this conversation and really enjoyed having you here today.
Yeah, thank you.